Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the queen of crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and for the fourth year in a row, I am here in lovely Torquay. It actually is kind of lovely today, in the south of England at the Agatha Christie Festival for a live episode of the podcast, this time all about true crime in Christie's work. However, this is the first year that I have dared to appear all by myself up here on the stage in the Spanish Barn. The first year when All About Agatha made a virtual appearance, I still had my late co-creator and co-host, Catherine Brobeck, by my side. And every year thereafter, I have appeared with a panel of experts. But this year, I do not have the academic muscle of a Mark Aldridge or a John Curran or a Jamie Berntal Hooker behind me. There is a distinct dearth of doctoral degrees up on this dais. So this could all go sideways, but let's get started because I have a lot to pack into this presentation if I want to leave time for questions, which I really do. First, I just have to thank the festival organizers for all that they do. Heather and Matt, you're the best. It really is such a joy to come here every year. But I particularly want to thank Jo Barlow, who does all of the coordinating. She is the reason this festival runs as smoothly as it does. She's also in charge of the volunteers, all those people wearing blue shirts who make such a difference every year. Your efforts are very much appreciated, and I would just love to give all these folks a big round of applause right now. All right, I'm going to give you all a general and blanket spoiler warning, which is more for the listeners at home or at the gym, where so many of you surely are listening to me on your elliptical machine or bench press or whatever. I spoil a bunch of titles in the course of this talk. For those here in the audience, don't worry. These are as light and minor of spoilers as I could manage, since I know you don't have the luxury of stopping the episode. I don't want anyone getting up and running out the door. This is just one of those topics that is difficult to cover without some spoilers, so I want you to note that at the outset. Okay, and we're almost done with the preambles, but I also have to acknowledge two people up front who were particularly helpful to me as I was researching this talk. First, there is a book published in 2010 written by Mike Holgate called Stranger Than Fiction, Agatha Christie's True Crime Inspirations, which is by no means the only book on this topic out there in the world. There's actually another book that came out in 2020 by Ann Powers titled True Crime Parallels to the Mysteries of Agatha Christie, and there are various blog posts out there on the web on this subject, many of them written by friends of mine. But the reason Mike Holgate's book is important to me is that I've been referencing it for years on the podcast, and it's thanks to this book that I've been wanting to do a talk for some time about the true crime parallels to be drawn in Christie's work. Also, Bill Peschel, who has published annotated versions of a number of Christie's novels in the United States via his and his wife Teresa's Peschel Press. Teresa spoke at the festival last year. He was kind enough to share his own list of true crime inspirations in Christie's work. He definitely helped me catch a few I would not have caught on my own. So I just wanted to thank him for his generosity up top. And if there is one takeaway that I want to impart to you all today, it is that when it comes to true crime in Christie, there is a lot of material, much, much more than you think there is. So let's get the basic stuff out of the way, shall we? When you read the title of my talk, True Crime Queen, The Real-Life Murders in Agatha Christie's Fiction, I'm going to bet there were two examples that came immediately to mind. First and foremost, Christie Crown Jewel Murder on the Orient Express, which incorporates the notorious true crime incident of the 1932 Lindbergh baby kidnapping, and tragically, it wasn't just a kidnapping, but a murder. That's not a typo in the headline, by the way, which would be doubly unfortunate if it were. That is an acceptable alternate spelling of kidnapped with the one P. I'll just note that when Murder on the Orient Express was published in 1934, the man who was eventually convicted and executed for the crime hadn't yet been arrested. The Lindbergh case was still fairly recent and developing at that point, so it was very audacious of Christie to do what she did with it. Okay, so the other obvious example is The Mousetrap, which recently had its 30,000th performance at the St. Martin's Theater. I also love that. Have you done it? Gets right to the point. You really do have to see the mousetrap if you visit London. It's an item to be ticked off any tourist's checklist. So similar to Murder on the Orient Express, this play of Christie's, which first came into being as a 1947 radio play, makes use of the real-life murder of a child as the motivation for the present-day murder. In this case, it was 12-year-old Dennis O'Neill, who suffered so horribly at the hands of two monstrous foster parents, dying in early 1945. His brother Terrence suffered alongside him and was a key witness in the ensuing trial, which is what this headline is about. I'll just note the date of this newspaper, which is February 14th, 1945. Sure, the bigger headline here is about the ongoing war effort, but the fact that there was anything on the front page other than the war effort at this point is significant, which is why the O'Neill case is known as the case that shared space with the war itself on the front pages. That's how harrowing it was. Okay, so we know that Christie used those two tragic murders to successful effect, to put it mildly. And then, even though there was no murder in real life, there are a lot of people who might also be thinking of the mirror cracked from side to side. I absolutely love this Tom Adams Fontana cover. Often I use first edition covers when I'm referring to a book, but the first edition of this one is a total snooze, I think, compared to this pre-Raphaelite hellscape. It's just really perfect. I've got a lot more great Fontana covers to come. Get excited. And of course, you'll be seeing lots more Tom Adams later today from my friend David Morris and later tonight. Anyway, this has been much debated, and it will continue to be much debated, except not by me right now. But there are many who believe that Christie must have been referencing in this novel the real-life story of Hollywood actor Gene Tierney, the birth of whose child in 1943 with developmental disabilities mirrors the backstory of a key character in the novel. It might also have to do with the situation surrounding the 1947 birth of Princess Christina of the Netherlands, who was born nearly blind as a result of a certain disease her mother, the future Queen Juliana, contracted while pregnant, though the princess's vision did improve a great deal over the course of her childhood. Agatha Christie claimed not to have based Mirror Cracked on either of these real-life situations, though perhaps she just wasn't conscious of drawing on them, or maybe it really was a coincidence. Strange things do happen. And here, many conversations about Christie's deployment of true crime, or at least true events in her fiction, comes to an end. Sometimes people like to point out that where one book was concerned, Christie was so ingenious, we have a reverse chain of events in which her book begat true crime. That would be The Pale Horse, which seems to have gone on to inspire one murderer in 1988, the so-called Mensa murderer, who used thallium to poison his noisy neighbor since he just wanted some peace and quiet, and who was found with a copy of The Pale Horse in his book collection. On a happier note, there were at least two instances of people realizing they were witnessing thallium poisoning in real life due to reading The Pale Horse. One was in 1975, and Christie received a letter from the woman who saved the day, but the other one made the news in 1977, just 1 year after Christie's death. Here is that fabulous headline, and in case you can't read it, we're not exactly in blaring front page territory here. What it says is, Agatha Christie book saves an infant's life. Now that is a headline I know she would have cherished. A nurse had been reading The Pale Horse, and she was the only one to properly diagnose the symptoms of a 19-month-old girl. Once the thallium poisoning was identified, the child made a swift recovery. So that's all very nice. I mean, the guy who poisoned his neighbors isn't so nice. But those are the highlights, the standouts where Christie and true crime are concerned. But oh, listeners, and here in the Spanish Barn, oh, spectators, there is so much more to be discussed. So let's begin at the beginning. Here we have the first three novels that Agatha Christie published: Mysterious Affair at Styles, The Secret Adversary, and The Murder on the Links. I'm only going to do this once, but I'd love to make a little time for some live audience participation right now. Who can tell me which of these novels has a significant real-world antecedent? A very real, very tragic event ripped from the annals of history. I've conveniently given each of these titles a letter: A for Styles, B for Adversary, C for Links. And I'd love for as many people as possible just to call out which letter you think it is. I was so hoping you would fall into my trap, and you did. So everyone said C. Lots of folks going for The Murder on the Links. But you know what? I really did fool you all, because the answer is D. All of the above. Let's go through it. All right, the biggest surprise here is The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And I want to be clear that the claim I'm about to make right now is speculative, though I hope in a principled and ultimately enlightening way. There is an old case of strychnine poisoning from the 19th century that sometimes gets cited as an inspiration for Styles. That's the case of William Palmer, or the Rugeley poisoner, as he is known. But for me, the connections between the two are too general, too tenuous to be worth going through. There is another case that feels much more convincing to me as a Styles antecedent. So back in 2021, Christie scholar Manjari Prabhu did a virtual talk here at the Agatha Christie Festival titled Agatha Christie in India, in which she referenced as an antecedent to Styles a real-life murder that took place in India in 1911 and became quite the global sensation. This case involved the death of Lady Frances Garnett Orme, or Lady Garnett, as I will be referring to her, even though I'm not sure that title would survive a lot of scrutiny. It sure sounds good, though. So Lady Garnett was staying at the Savoy Hotel in Mussoorie, India, which was an upscale hotel frequented by British and other European travelers and overlooking the Himalayas. Lady Garnett had become friendly there with a spiritualist named Eva Mount Stevens, a former governess who quickly became Lady Garnett's confidential companion. It seems they'd grown super close, to the point where Eva was a named beneficiary in Lady Garnett's will. Do we feel like we're reading an Agatha Christie novel yet? So not to get too bogged down in details, Lady Garnett was found dead in her locked hotel room, and it was ascertained that somehow she had taken prussic acid, i.e. cyanide. I'll just note that one of the doctors who examined her also ended up being poisoned, in his case by strychnine, which was the key poison in the mysterious affair at Styles. Now, we have no way of verifying whether Christie actually drew on this case when she was writing Styles, but we know that she wrote this book many years ahead of its publication in 1920, in and around the middle teens. Dr. John Curran says 1916. And at that point, this case would still have been fairly fresh in the public consciousness. It was reported on by the British press a whole bunch. We do know Agatha Christie read the newspapers regularly, so there's a good chance she read about it at the time. But again, I want to be clear, we do not know this for sure. And we don't because, unfortunately, Christie didn't talk much about her process or her inspirations, even in those notebooks that Dr. Curran has so assiduously translated for us. And yet, the one aspect of the Mussoorie murder case I find compelling as a potential inspiration for the mysterious affair at Styles is that much was made of the fact that Eva Mount Stevens, the companion, had left the hotel days before Lady Garnett was murdered. This was one of the main reasons she ended up being acquitted, even though there was no other major suspect. Her main defense, unsurprisingly, was that Lady Garnett had died by suicide. The judge in this case, when he was acquitting Eva Mount Stevens, said that they would likely never know what happened, and there were some who speculated that Stevens must have used her spiritual powers to induce Lady Garnett to poison herself from afar. This is why we can see in this newspaper from the time, it's referred to as the crystal gazing trial. Now, can't you just see a young Agatha Miller/Christie, depending on when she was thinking about this, noodling on this seemingly supernatural element of the case, and then thinking to herself, perhaps as she was putting away any number of poisons in the dispensary where she was working during the First World War, now how could I make it so that there is a perfectly rational explanation for a poison placed in a room not to actually work till many days later so that the murderer could leave the premises and be seemingly cleared? Again, this is conjecture, but I find that connection to be compelling and fascinating. I should add that there's this whole made-up story out there about how Rudyard Kipling was fascinated by this case, and he told Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to use it in his Sherlock Holmes series, who in turn told Christie to use it. As far as I know, Christie and Doyle were not in contact with each other, certainly not that early in Christie's career, and I mention this because I'm determined not to fall into the trap of treating these theories as facts, that they're true crime antecedents that definitely happened. Sometimes we do know for sure that Christie was inspired by a true crime case. Other times we don't, though we can use clues, such as the pervasive presence of the case in the news of the day, and striking similarities, not just general ones, between the real crime and the fictional crime to make our case. So I'm not saying 100% that Christie was inspired by the death of Lady Garnett, but I think it's possible. Happily, we can be certain that Christie was drawing on real incidents where her next two novels are concerned. So next we've got The Secret Adversary, and you could be wondering, what the heck am I talking about here? How could this first foray of Tommy and Tuppence have anything to do with reality? But let's remember that this novel opens with the sinking of the Lusitania. Quoting now from the text, page 1, it was 2 p.m. on the afternoon of May 7th, 1915, The Lusitania had been struck by 2 torpedoes in succession and was sinking rapidly, while the boats were being launched with all possible speed. This sinking of a passenger ship without warning was a war crime. So this is a true crime, albeit an unusual one. And here in Christie's second novel, we see her using a real-life tragedy from a few years earlier that everyone would have remembered as a catalyst for a quick and impromptu handoff in which a young American gets involved in some risky business. And of course, the sinking of the Lusitania was a key contributor toward the Americans getting involved in the war effort. So in this way, I think it's a really clever use of a real event for purposes of a fictional adventure tale. All right, let's move on now to Christie's third novel, The Murder on the Links, because this one is thoroughly ripped from the headlines, and we actually have Christie's word for it this time, because she does mention the origins of this novel in her autobiography. Here goes. My third book was Murder on the Links. This, I think, must have been written not long after a cause célèbre which occurred in France. I can't remember the name of any of the participants by now. It was some tale of masked men who had broken into a house, killed the owner, tied up and gagged the wife. The mother-in-law had also died, but only apparently because she had choked on her false teeth. Anyway, the wife's story was disproved, and there was a suggestion that it was the wife who had killed her husband and that she had never been tied up at all, or only by an accomplice. It struck me as a good plot on which to weave my own story, starting with the wife's life after she had been acquitted of the murder. A mysterious woman would appear somewhere, having been the heroine of a murder case years ago. I said it in France this time. So Agatha Christie may not have remembered the names of the participants, but fortunately I can supply them. The wife who was suspected of having orchestrated a break-in is Marguerite Steinheil, also known as the killer courtesan or pompe funèbre, i.e. death sucker. For reasons that are actually too racy to go into right now, we are only in the 4 o'clock hour here, so maybe ask me later tonight, perhaps over a drink while we're checking out some Tom Adams covers. Here is a painting of her, which is quite accurate, right? Since we have the photograph to compare it to. Good to know those painters back then were good at their jobs. She had engaged in a number of high-profile affairs, including one with the president of France, which had made her already rather notorious when, in 1908, she was found bound and gagged in this very bed, with the dead bodies of her husband and stepmother also in the house. It was her stepmother, not her mother-in-law, as Christie said, and I never found any other reference to the older woman choking on her false teeth. I'm going to chalk that up to Christie's ever-fertile imagination. Marguerite Steinheil was acquitted, though everyone seems to have been convinced she was involved somehow in what happened to her husband and stepmother. She moved to England, where she remarried and lived for many years thereafter, and we won't go into the rather torturous plot of the Murder on the Links, but there's no question that Madame d'Aubray in the novel is Marguerite Steinheil, down to the fact that they both have daughters named Martha. And while the real-life Martha didn't figure as prominently into the case, I think Christie made much better use of the fictional daughter. So there's an argument to be made that Christie borrowed too much from this real case in that she felt too beholden to the facts, which made the book less elegant and streamlined than her books would become. Christie biographer Laura Thompson, who is speaking at the festival tomorrow, she makes this very argument, saying that The Murder on the Links has a kind of non-artistic complexity, and I agree with that. I think it's also just an early book. I think we can see the same sort of over-egged quality in The Mysterious Affair at Styles, which Christie would move beyond very quickly. I just want to note this because I think we're going to see an evolution in how Christie would go on to use true crime for purposes of her fiction as we get further into her canon. So we can see that from the very beginning, Christie wasn't shy about using real-life events in her fiction. I firmly believe that there are references to other true crimes, or at least true-life incidents in Christie's books that we are all missing, since we're reading her books decades, and at this point, centuries after they were first published. One of the revelations of reading Christie's work as closely as Catherine and I did was the realization that Christie is constantly mentioning true crime cases. She was just clearly as much of a true crime junkie as so many of us are these days. There is one book in particular that I think provides excellent evidence of Christie's fascination with true crime, where the public interest in true crime is itself ultimately responsible for all the murders and intrigue that take place in the book. In many ways, I think this is Christie's ultimate true crime novel, and it's a bit of an unsung gem, though I've been doing my best to sing it on the podcast whenever I can, so this is another great opportunity. Many of you know what I'm talking about. I am speaking of Mrs. McGinty's Dead, in which we learn that the titular murder happened because Mrs. McGinty recognized someone in her small community of Broadhenny to be involved in one of the 4 past crimes reported on in a newspaper article that she had read. And we learn all about these 4 past crimes, 3 of which have easily recognizable antecedents in true crimes from the past. So the first refers to Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen and his mistress Ethel Leneve, both pictured here, who were suspected in 1910 of doing away with Dr. Crippen's wife, though this remains a baffling case. Crippen and Leneve boarded a transatlantic steamer to escape, but the captain recognized them and sent a wireless telegram to the authorities, just as the boat was leaving. So the telegram worked, with the result that they were taken into custody upon landing in Canada, which was very exciting. This was the first time that a telegram had been used in this way, and I think it goes a long way toward why Crippen remains such a popularized figure. Dr. Crippen was executed for the crime, though it seems now, due to new evidence, that he may not have actually been guilty. Ethel Leneve was exonerated, and she went on to live her life for many decades thereafter. The second past crime in Mrs. McGinty's Dead is an allusion to Edith Thompson and Frederick Bywaters, 2 more lovebirds for us. They were embroiled in an extramarital affair. In this case, they were both convicted and executed in 1923 for the murder of Thompson's husband, despite Bywaters claiming that he had killed the husband by accident and that Edith had nothing to do with it. I should mention that the Edith Thompson case also gets a lot of play in Christie Crown Jewel, Crooked House, where actress Magda Leonides is desperate to play Edith Thompson on the stage. It's the role of a century. And then we have a fictionalized version of the Constance Kent case. This is an oldie. All the way back in 1860, Constance Kent was a 16-year-old suspected of murdering her 3-year-old half-brother. She ended up being released without being prosecuted, but went on to confess to the crime 5 years later, served 20 years for it, and then moved to Australia, where she settled for many years, living to 100 years of age. Many still believe that her confession was false and that she was actively concealing the true perpetrator. I don't need to tell you which of the fictional analogs to these true crime cases turns out to be the relevant one, but it is one of them. And I think Mrs. McGinty's Dead alone is solid evidence of Christie's predilection for true crime cases. But we have so much more evidence, and I'll be honest with you, I had to cut the list of novels and short stories I'm going to go through now in half, maybe in more than half, otherwise we'd be here forever. So just please know that this list has already been whittled down. If you would like to hear about more true crime references in Christie, shoot me an email, because I've got a bunch of PowerPoint slides on the cutting room floor that I'm itching to share. I really do. This could easily have been one of my 2-hour recorded podcast episodes, but unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I only get 1 hour with you here at the Agatha Christie Festival. So I'm going to run through these fairly quickly. I don't think anyone can reasonably deny that The Affair at the Victory Ball, which is Christie's very first Poirot short story, first published in 1923, but not collected in the UK till much later in Poirot's early cases, is heavily based on the death in 1918 of Billy Carlton, a young up-and-coming actor in the London theater scene who attended one of the many victory balls at the end of the First World War dressed like this. Here's another shot of that outfit. It's rather diaphanous. Basically, it's see-through. Very risque. And allow me to direct you to the caption of that first photo. Miss Billy Carlton in the costume she wore at the fatal Victory Ball. This gown was designed by her evil friend, Reggie Devol. Evil friend. You know you've made a wrong turn or two in life if you're being described in print as an evil friend. So it was this designer, Reggie Devol, who was charged with manslaughter, actually. Eventually, he pled guilty to supplying Billy with the cocaine that killed her by way of overdose, which is exactly what happens to Christie's fictional victim. Billy died, by the way, at the Savoy, so another real-life murder at another Savoy. The twist is that Christie's mystery is solvable by way of the costumes worn by the partygoers who went dressed as figures within the classical harlequinade. We know Christie was obsessed with the harlequinade. At the time she wrote this short story, she had already written some early poetry about it. She would very soon go on to do her Mysterious Mr. Quinn collection of short stories, playing around with these classical characters. But fascinatingly, in real life, Reggie Devol, he actually attended this ball wearing a harlequin costume. So I just think that's remarkable. All right, that wasn't fast at all, so I'm going to have to actually run through some more of these quickly now. The short story, The Plymouth Express, which was first collected in Poirot Investigates and then later expanded into The Mystery of the Blue Train, potentially had its origins in the brutal beating and murder aboard a train of Florence Nightingale Shore, the goddaughter of, yes, nursing legend Florence Nightingale. I believe the short story Sing a Song of Sixpence, which was first collected in the Listerdale Mystery, is related to the Croydon case, or the Croydon poisonings, even though the means of murder and other details are totally different between the two. The real case involved arsenic poisoning, whereas Christie's fictional murder victim had her head crushed in. So don't let anyone tell you Christie always went for the genteel poisons. The reason I'm making the connection is that Christie actually wrote about this case at length in a newspaper article for the Sunday Chronicle in August 1929. And what happened is that 3 members of an extended family were killed over the course of a little less than a year. There was no obvious suspect, no one who would have had a motive for killing all 3. The case remained unsolved, casting a shadow of guilt on the remaining family members. And it's this element of the case that Christie focuses on at great length in her article, the unfairness of it. And I think we can see her creating a similar scenario in this short story, where her fictional victim is survived by 4 family members, all of whom inherit from her equally. And it ends up being someone wholly outside the family who done it, which is sort of like Christie's dream scenario for the Croydon case. She felt so badly for the surviving family members. And I'll note that this short story first came out in serialized form just a few months after Christie's article, which I think significantly strengthens the argument for the connection to be made between the two. All right. This one I have to admit I'm getting entirely from Bill Peschel, who makes, I think, a convincing case that the excellent The ABC Murders may have a true crime antecedent in the infamous case of William Herbert Wallace, who was convicted of murdering his wife. So one night while playing chess, not dominoes, he was given a message to appear at a certain address the next evening to discuss insurance with an unknown person. Wallace went only to discover that the address didn't exist. This was 1931, so no sat-nav or Google Maps, alas. And when he returned home, he discovered his wife brutally beaten to death. That was his story, anyway. He was found guilty of her murder, but in a very unusual turn of events, this conviction was later overturned, and the case remains unsolved. So this man's seeming predicament just may be an inspiration for the uber-elaborate frame-up job of another person who goes by all 3 of his names, which we are presented with in the ABC Murders. All right, for anyone who has nightmares about spoiled fish paste, I know I do, you may be interested to know that this seeming means of poison in Sad Cypress was potentially inspired by the alleged notorious poisoner Annie Hearn, though I should note she was never convicted, and also potentially by the notorious poisoner Herbert Armstrong, who was convicted of murdering his wife and who also seems to have poisoned a professional rival as well. And I believe that Armstrong is the only solicitor in the United Kingdom ever to be hanged for murder, though who knows what the future may have in store. Technically, I'm a lawyer, so I get to make jokes like that. All right, in The Body in the Library, Christie used the very name of real-life murder victim Ruby Keene, though she did add an E on the end of Keene. This just feels too specific to be a coincidence, and I'll note that, like the titular Body in the Library, Keene was strangled to death. This was a true crime case from 1937, just 5 years before Christie's book was published. In The Labors of Hercules, hi there, Augustus, I believe that Christie references true crime many times, actually, but I'll highlight just one of these instances. In The Lernaean Hydra, we have shades of the so-called Kidwelly mystery, in which another solicitor was accused of poisoning his wife. This is Harold Greenwood, who was tried and acquitted for the murder of his wife, Mabel. Incidentally, this case is sometimes mentioned as an antecedent to the mysterious affair at Styles, and I learned in David Morris's talk last year at the festival that Christie herself mentioned this case when she was discussing the cover of Styles, fully aware that people would think of it when they read her book. The Greenwood trial didn't happen until 1920, so this was very current when she was figuring out the cover for her book. And as we know, Styles was written many years before it was published, so there's no way that this influenced the writing of that book. But it's interesting that Christie was aware of the case, and I think the parallels to the situation in the Lernaean Hydra are striking, in particular the role of local gossip in bringing about the exhumation of the wife's body and the accusation of murder against the husband. This is one of my favorite sort of Greek mythical monsters brought to life, using gossip as a monster. Just very, very brilliant of Christie. Okay, So, in Towards Zero, which I maintain is a Christie crown jewel, there is a reference in the text itself to the Kentish Town trunk case, which is not a real case, but I believe this may have been Christie's sly way of revealing one of the origins of her story, the Monte Carlo trunk murder, in which this man, Vere Thomas Gould, a charming former tennis champion, murdered a woman in 1907, concealing her body in, yes, a trunk, or suitcase for my fellow Americans out there. Catherine and I did make that mistake on the podcast, which was found to be leaking blood in a train station in Marseille where it had been dropped off. Gould actually pulled off this murder along with his wife, so the details don't line up exactly with what we have in Towards Zero, but there are parallels. And this was another big case early in the 20th century that was likely to have caught Christie's eye. Here is a cover story in a French tabloid. This is the only time I feel I have to warn you that the image depicted, which is a drawing, it's not a photograph, is fairly graphic. The caption reads in French, "The Monte Carlo crime, a woman cut in pieces." So I mentioned that Christie wrote an article in 1929 about the Croydon poisonings. She actually wrote about another true crime case much later in her career, and this was the case of Charles Bravo, who died in 1876 from antimony poisoning. And to this day, we have no idea if he died by suicide or was murdered by his wife or by a doctor who had had a previous affair with his wife, or maybe even by his housekeeper. The cloud of suspicion that hung over these people was also heavy, which is what spoke to Christie about the Croydon poisonings as well. And as any Christie fan knows, Christie just made much hay of this in her stories. For instance, in Ordeal by Innocence. I also love that cover. That's exactly how I feel when I'm writing often. And then especially in my, and I hope our, beloved Five Little Pigs. She also referenced the Charles Bravo case a number of times later in her career, both in The Clocks during that extended sequence where Poirot and Colin Lamb discuss non-fictional and fictional gems of the crime genre. They actually discuss a lot more fiction than non-fiction, which is why this is the only time I'm going to mention that conversation. And also in Elephants Can Remember. I honestly feel bad bringing up the fact that Christie mentioned the Bravo case in The Clocks and Elephants Can Remember, because that makes it sound like it was significant that she brought up true crime when, as I already mentioned, she did it all the time, so much so that it would be ludicrous for me to go through every textual mention. But there's one book where one case gets mentioned repeatedly, and it ends up being a big old clue to who done it. And that is A Caribbean Mystery, where the true crime case in question is the one involving George Joseph Smith, Shudder. This case from 1915 often goes by the spine-tingling name of The Brides in the Bath. And I won't go into more detail because I don't want to spoil A Caribbean Mystery, and I don't have time anyway. But it's actually a case that I referenced directly in my first mystery novel, The Busybody. And you can bet I was thinking of Christie when I did so. If I had more time, I would right now go into the two true crime antecedents we have for At Bertram's Hotel, both of which are fascinating. But instead, I'd like to focus for a moment on the mysterious case of the children behind the fireplace. So I have to thank YA author Martha Jocelyn, who I had on the podcast recently and who was here at the festival, for directing my attention to a great blog, The Passing Tramp, which did a very informative post on this topic that I'm going to borrow from heavily right now. So, as many of you know, Christie depicted the same curious, creepy scene 3 times over in The Pale Horse, By the Pricking of My Thumbs, and Sleeping Murder. The scene was of an old woman with white hair holding a glass of milk and inquiring, "Was it your poor child? That's where it was, behind the fireplace." And then the woman specifies a certain time of day for some unknown but extremely creepy reason. The scene wasn't exactly the same each time. In The Pale Horse, it's related as a memory, and it happens at a quote-unquote mental home, where the time specified is 12:10. In By the Pricking of My Thumbs, we see it happen at a retirement home, and the time specified is 10 past 11. And then in Sleeping Murder, we see it again happening, and this time it's at a sanatorium, where the time of day specified is 10:30. Also, the incident is central to By the Pricking of My Thumbs, whereas it's merely incidental to the other 2 books. And I will be honest, there is a good chance that this was simply a fixation of Christie's, just an unsettling scene that she thought up and couldn't get rid of easily. So she put it in 3 books until she finally exorcised it in the final one of these 3 that she wrote, By the Pricking of My Thumbs. But you know what? I regret to inform you that there was a real incident involving children buried behind a fireplace. So, in 1950, in Baltimore, in the United States, a woman who lived in a small second-story apartment in this rundown three-story row house, it's the red brick one in the middle. She lost her wedding ring when it slipped through a crack in the fireplace mantelpiece. So the ring dropped down into the hearth, which had been boarded over for ages. And when she pried the fireplace open, she found an old bundle of cloth in it, which turned out to contain the skeleton of a baby. Unfortunately, two more of these bundles were discovered in the fireplace, wrapped in newspaper that dated them to 1921 and 1923. So it seems that a married couple lived in the apartment at that time, a husband who may have been abusing his second wife. This woman had two older stepchildren and three additional young children she had given birth to, all of whom were under her care. And she seems to have had some severe emotional struggles. She would go on to die by suicide in 1932 in that very same apartment, in the fireplace, actually. And while we'll never know precisely what happened, I don't think there's any question that something very tragic and very awful was happening inside that apartment. And a newspaper account of this was picked up in British newspapers in 1950. The type here is pretty small, so I'll just read out what the blurb says. It's at the bottom. Skeletons found. Skeletons of 3 babies, dead for more than 25 years, were discovered behind a boarded-up fireplace in a house in Baltimore, USA. I think I would remember that if I read that. It's certainly a memorable little blurb there. Of course, this doesn't account for the old lady, the glass of milk, the time being specified, and precisely when Christie wrote Sleeping Murder is a can of worms that we simply cannot wriggle around in right now. We just don't have the time. The other 2 books were, of course, written much later. So while we have no way of knowing whether Christie saw this account, I do think it's a fascinating possibility. And you can bet that I'll be looking into whether or not we can specifically date that bit about the old lady with the glass of milk in Sleeping Murder. I have just never thought to do this until doing this research, whether it may have been added after the fact. It's just such a tricky book to date, but watch this space. Before I end, I'd like to touch on 2 more of Christie's novels late in her career, just to make a point about how she did what she did when it came to true crime and fictional murder. In 1969's Halloween Party, we know that Christie perused the newspapers, horrified by all the violent acts that she read about, and moved by them to write this grisly story in which not 1 but 2 children are killed and an attempt is made on the life of a third. I think she had to have been thinking about the Moores murders, which was an extremely high-profile child sexual assault and murder spree committed by a terrifying young couple, a man and a woman, between 1963 and 1965. And then 1 year later, in the 1970s, Passenger to Frankfurt, still taking in everything that was happening around her, still horrified by the state of the world, she went a step further, and she created what she labeled an extravaganza, a what-if scenario meant to serve as a warning, an admonition that we very well might be headed in this direction if we aren't careful. Sound familiar? I'll quote very briefly from that extraordinary introduction to Passenger to Frankfurt, in which she talks about reading the front page of the newspaper. Here goes. Every day there is a killing, a girl strangled, elderly woman attacked and robbed of her meager savings, young men or boys attacking or attacked, buildings and telephone kiosks smashed and gutted, drug smuggling, robbery and assault, children missing and children's murdered bodies found not far from their homes. Can this be England? Is England really like this? One feels, no, not yet, but it could be. And while I don't think Halloween Party or Passenger to Frankfurt are her best books by any stretch, I do think we can see a progression in the way Christie is willing to use real-life events for her purposes. In The Murder on the Links, I think we can see her twisting herself into knots, pun intended, trying to incorporate the underlying true story. But very quickly, she began to use true crime inspirations the same way she used true people inspirations. Interesting characters that she came across in her travels or in her daily life, who she would purposely keep at arm's length so that she could retain whatever interested her and otherwise make them her own. I'll quote again from that passage in her autobiography about the true crime she used for The Murder on the Links. It struck me as a good plot on which to weave my own story. That was the approach she took, even if she didn't totally pull it off in that early book, starting with the true crime and then going in a different direction to make it her own. I think this is why so often the true crime element in her fiction is sort of siloed or isolated as a backstory. Sometimes it's a source of revenge that motivates the central murders that are being investigated, as in Murder on the Orient Express and The Mousetrap, or the true crime parallel is a murder in the past that has to be covered up by more murders in the present. That's what we have in Mrs. McGinty's Dead and A Caribbean Mystery. And in closing, I have to say that it's really quite striking to me, having conducted the research I did for this talk, how effectively Christie took what are often brutal and deeply unpleasant crimes in which real flesh and blood people, oftentimes children, are victimized in all sorts of horrible ways and made them, dare I say, entertaining. I think this is precisely why the true crime inspirations of so many of Christie's stories remain hidden and so rarely remarked on. We don't finish the mystery of the blue train and dwell on the brutal beating of the victim, even though it's absolutely in there. It's a key part of the story. What's more memorable are her temporal obfuscations and other tricks that she employs, or the children in the fireplace. What a horrible thing. And yet look what she does with it in By the Pricking of My Thumbs. The ultimate secret is nightmarish, it's true, but the adventure that we go on with Tommy and Tuppence to uncover it is madcap and diverting, at least some of the time. Mrs. McGinty's Dead, riddled as it is with true crime, hinges on a cleverly phrased spoken clue, as well as one of her tried and true naming tricks. And we've got costuming hijinks in The Affair at the Victory Ball, and one of her A-plus blocking clues in A Caribbean Mystery. Or sometimes it's not the puzzle we focus on, but the fictional characters and situations that Christie created. The innocent doctor in The Lurnaean Hydra, who I find to be a much more sympathetic character than Harold Greenwood. Or Rachel Argyle in Ordeal by Innocence, who is endlessly fascinating, and I think it's worth considering her as a mixture of both Charles and Florence. Bravo. In the ABC murders, Christie took the notion of a man being framed for murder and ran with it so hard that if she did base that book in any way on William Herbert Wallace, it's like she went nuclear when she did so. Figuring out how Christie used these true crime parallels is just as important, more important than ascertaining those instances in which she did. Which is why I love how we can see her riffing on true events at the end of her career, like a very grumpy, disaffected Miles Davis or John Coltrane, taking in what was going on around her and then using it to motivate herself to create a fictional crime that would provide commentary on the current state of the world. I think we can really see an evolution here, a progression, which is yet one more way to refute that tired old story that Christie's career peaked in the 1930s or 1940s. The truth is that there is always more to Christie, if only we read carefully and thoughtfully enough. So thank you for allowing me to do just that for a little bit with you today. I hope that you found it interesting, and I thank you for coming. All right, now I would love to open it up for questions. Feel free to ask me anything, by the way. You can ask me about the talk specifically, but it could also be anything Agatha Christie related or all about Agatha related, whatever you would like.
Hi, Kemper. Thanks for this talk today. Really good to see you on your own and owning it. But I just wanted to ask you which true crime situation is your sort of favorite to think about? That one that Agatha used, though, not like a modern one, but one that she used and you can really see, and I don't know, just one that jumps out at you.
Yeah, I mean, it's so strange to say, well, it's like that podcast, My Favorite Murder, right? Like, I don't really have a favorite murder. And to be clear, thank you for your question, because I think it gives me an opportunity also to clarify that I think I have so much admiration for what Christie did by taking something so ugly and making entertainment out of it. I actually think that is kind of like, one of the best things that one can do when one is trying to figure out, like, how do you live a good life? How do you make lemonade out of lemons, right? So probably my favorites are the ones that are so abjectly horrible, which she turns into something. So, I mean, The Mousetrap, I think, is one that is just, when you learn about just the pain and the horror and the terror of what happened. And she's not hiding it either. I mean, she's mining it, she's using it in that play. And then you think about how much she has entertained people for now, 70 plus years. It's just remarkable, and I'm in awe that she managed to do that. Not that there aren't, some risks to that, and it's something that I didn't shy away from when I did my 4-hour episode on the Mousetrap for All About Agatha. I interviewed one of the relatives of the O'Neill family, and while I think he had some issues with certain things, he actually had more of an issue with a recent movie that had been made, and not with Christie herself, and with the play, which he had actually seen with Terence, who was the younger boy, and he talks about going to see the Mousetrap with Terence, and what a lovely man Terence actually was. And I'm glad that Terence was able to see the play and apparently walk out smiling.
Hi, so I'm glad you talked about the Mousetrap, because that is probably one of my favorite episodes that you've done, and I found the topic of, how the nephew talked about generational trauma. So one of the things after you did your run through of all your reviews of the Agatha books is when you go back and you look at the stories differently. And so I guess my question is, in the future, is there potentially an opportunity for you to go back and again take sort of more of a closer psychological look at the different characters and kind of doing a more deeper delve? And I know you've done sort of different episodes where you look at different aspects of that, but again, because that episode was so strong and it was so moving, I was just wondering if you were going to do anything more along the psychological aspects.
Yeah, I think there's, I am still blown away by how much there is to investigate as to Christie. And when Catherine and I started the podcast and we said, okay, this is a finite project, right? Which is probably good because we didn't want to feel like we were going to be doing it for the rest of our lives. We always figured, and then after that, maybe it'll last a little bit. Who knows? We'll get there when we get there. And then unfortunately, I only got there myself. But I am at no loss for future episodes, let's put it that way. So yes, I don't know if I have specific plans to do something, a more psychological analysis per se, but I think that's part of what I'm doing, when I revisit these. And every time you drill down deeper, you find more because the texts are that rich. And I have no plans to stop doing that anytime soon. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you have no plans to stop, by the way. I was curious, you bring up the Pale Horse, and I know that the Pale Horse was also responsible for catching poisoners, right? The teacup poisoner Graham Young was caught because, police were reading the Pale Horse and recognized the symptoms of his poisoning victims. Did you find any more, sort of more connections in terms of that type of effect that Christie had on
the reverse, the kind of reverse thing, right?
Yeah.
The Pale Horse is really the one where I'm sure that there are others. The Pale Horse is the one, though, that people often identify because there are multiple instances of it, as you're saying. And I think that's because it's the thallium of it all. She was not the first one to use thallium, though, which is often the case, that Christie wasn't necessarily the first to do something. I believe that there was a Niall Marsh that was used thallium earlier, but I think she often did it best, and I think she did do it best in The Pale Horse because it's so brilliant. And I think when you finish that book, you really do know what the symptoms of thallium poisoning and what that would look like and how it was so bewildering and why it all works. So I think that's why that one has those multiple instances. And I have to imagine that kind of reverse, that's not something that Christie ever expected. Like the Mensa murders happened in the late 80s, so she was never around, but I know she would have been so horrified by the notion of someone. That's so breaking the rules of the game that the author and the reader are playing when they read a murder mystery, that this is fictional and we're never going to use this, my God, like in any sort of, it's not a how-to, exactly, but it happens.
Hi, Kemper. I'm so glad that you brought up that question about when Sleeping Murder might have been written, because this is such a fun little fact. So it at least speaks to its having been revised after 1950. And the really fun thing about the idea that Mrs. Lancaster, is it, who we meet in that guise, the idea that she's been kind of popping up and she's been moved around all these care homes. And I love how that happens through the novels. And it'd be brilliant if you could bottom out whether she first revises Sleeping Murder immediately that she sees the Baltimore reporting and goes, oh, fun fact, let's bung that in, or whether it's only when she comes to write The Pale Horse, where we can definitely say that's when she put that in contemporaneously, because there's no funny business about when she wrote that. There's no funny business about when she wrote Pricking, and this is the point where she goes, oh, cool, let's finally get those babies out of the fireplace thing. And so, yeah, is that the third instance, or does she do Pricking and then think, oh, yeah, no, I still haven't published Sleeping Murder, so let's bung in that other one. So I don't know whether Mark or John can speak to what, if any, archives there are of transcripts and revisions, and I know that's really tough and blah, blah, but please bottom it out if you can, because it's so fun.
Yeah, no, it's very tough, and so Sleeping Murder, because that was the second to last episode that I had done after Catherine passed away, I did that, and my co-host was Tony Medewer, actually, who I believe is speaking tomorrow, or he's speaking at the festival, and we got into that a little bit, because there's just a lot of disagreement between a lot of scholars, between and among a lot of scholars, as to, it's so hard, especially because it's, A, when did she write it isn't even clear, and then how many times and when, and how did she revise it, because obviously this is a book that could have been revised pretty much as much as she wanted, since it was sitting unpublished for so long, and yeah, definitely more to investigate there. Always good to have a mystery.
Another question here.
Hi, I'm making my way through the 3-hour Sleeping Murder episode at the moment. It's quite a ride. I was just wondering, you've obviously gone through all of them now, with or without Catherine, and I just wondered, are there any books that when you dug deeper you realised you hated, or when you dug deeper you realised you were completely wrong, as in, were there any that sort of flipped your view from there to there, either way?
I feel that impelled by the memory of Catherine to admit, and she always was very forcible about this, that she was the Five Little Pigs stan of the podcast, and she is really the one who brought me over from the dark side of not appreciating Five Little Pigs. So it was quite a revelation when we reread it and really thought about it as deeply as we did for the podcast. I had always liked it. I hadn't disliked it. I wasn't one of those people who thinks it's boring. You're wrong if you think it's boring. But I certainly, when we started the podcast, I would not have said that it would be our number one ranked novel. So I definitely was surprised, I think, by my reread on that one. The only title that comes to mind in the reverse direction, usually it was appreciating aspects of a novel that I hadn't even discovered before, and wow, what a deeper sort of sense I have of these novels, and I like them even more. Ordeal by Innocence is actually a novel that has so much to speak for it, but I had very fond memories of it, I think partially for the Donald Sutherland adaptation, which also did not, upon rewatching it again, I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting. But my read of it, I was not as enamored of the novel as I thought that I was going to be. So that's one that went a little bit in the reverse direction. Yeah. We have one up here. Please, but actually, no, wait for the microphone for the folks at home, please.
I thought I'd give you the opportunity, Amber, if there was anything that you left on the cutting room floor that really pained you that you'd love to bring up right now.
Well, at Bertram's Hotel, there was this very famous train robbery that had happened just before the book actually came out, and I think it's so interesting to contextualize one's read of that book. I think it gives a much better appreciation for what the book is. So I was disappointed to have to cut that one, because I think it can really actually affect the read, whereas some of these are just more like, oh, okay, good to know, And that's always the wonderful thing with Christie too, which is that you don't have to know. You don't need any of that background. She was good, so good that she would put it in there and she'd make these references. So sometimes there's a little Easter egg, or just the knowledge deepens your understanding, but more of a superficial kind of an experience is still A-okay, and you're mainly getting out of it what she wants you to get out of it, what's important. So yeah, but that was one I wish I could have spoken about a little more. And then Bess Sedgwick also has a little bit of a real life analog as well, this figure who is really, really fascinating. So that's why that one sort of has two antecedents. And there are just a lot of other true crime cases, especially from the first couple of decades of the 20th century, which is just a very, it feels anyway, like a very murder-heavy, crime-heavy sort of a time. And there were a lot of other cases that she referenced all the time that didn't necessarily have interesting analogs in terms of a short story or a novel, but it would have been nice to also mention them, but we'll leave that for now.
Is it possible that the influences were just subconscious as opposed to conscious?
Absolutely. I mean, that's, my theory on the mirror cracked from side to side is that it was subconscious. The Gene Tierney thing had been in the news. People did know about that. Certainly there was reporting on the Dutch royal family as well. And that was all, about a decade before she would have been writing The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. And I just feel like sometimes you have this foundation of cultural knowledge that you can sort of draw from. And I believe that's very much how Christie worked. I mean, I think she was an incredibly engaged person. She read newspapers, she talked to people, she was sociable, even though she, wouldn't have wanted to do what I'm doing right now, standing on a dais on a microphone. That was her nightmare. But she loved talking to people and going to dinner parties and having conversations and opinions and learning different things. So, and she was an autodidact from, an early age. So I think she just knew a lot. And I think that part of her genius was being able to draw on those things subconsciously as she was writing. And I think if it had been more conscious than that, it would have bored her, honestly. I don't think she was interested in saying, I'm going to take this case and do. So 100%. But I think that doesn't necessarily negate the exercise itself, or I think sometimes looking at the parallels to be drawn can just sort of show you what was going on in the background, as it were, as she was working on these books. Well, thank you all so much again. And like I said, grab me if you'd like afterward. And this has just been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kemper.
I hope you all enjoyed that live episode. True crime queen, the real-life murders in Agatha Christie's fiction. I had a lot of fun researching it and presenting it at the festival. It's such a joy to be able to commune with like-minded Christie fanatics, Christie freaks, if you will. Freaks in the very best of ways. For my next episode, I will be speaking with the YA mystery author Maureen Johnson, who has been on the podcast before, but she is involved in a very exciting new project in collaboration with the author-illustrator Jay Cooper. The two of them have created a book that's coming out within a few short weeks. It'll already be out in the United States when the episode airs. It's called You Are the Detective, The Creeping Hand Murder, a solve-it-yourself mystery. This is a very puzzly murder mystery that they have created, which involves sifting through clues and evidence, not just in text form, but very much in visual form as well. More will be explained when I speak with them, but I enjoyed the heck out of this book. I got an early look at it, and I think many of you are going to really love it as well. So that will be next time. And until then, you can always check out the podcast's bonus content over on Patreon. There's a link in the show notes. For this month, I reviewed A Mind to Murder by P.D. James, her second Adam Dalgleish novel, and second novel overall. I'm going through those in publication order. There aren't 66 of them, alas, but I have lots of Dalgleish in my future. You can email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Instagram at allaboutagatha. You can find me at my author website, kemperdonovan.com. And I invite you to peruse and buy my first two mystery novels in the Ghostwriter mystery series. Links to all that good stuff in the show notes. Please take a moment to give All About Agatha a rating and or a review. It helps out the podcast. It means a lot to me. And I'll see you next time. Bye.